Should we get started?
We might as well.
I would say, yeah. Go for it.
Well, you all know, I'm sure, that there's two types of wells, a dug well and a drilled well. Yeah. Right? And you'll know that if you see a little pump inside the house when you go to see it, it's probably going to be a shallow well, not much over 100 feet, kind of a basic thing.
Yeah.
Most dug wells, you can't do a water quantity this time, correct?
That's right. So a dug well, you'll often see in the yard, it's a large, like concrete cylinder, right? They're kind of hard to miss. They're really big concrete round cylinder that you'll see in the yard, and that's a dug well. So a drilled well is going to be much smaller, and they have what's called the casement, which is just your pipe that they use when they bore down. And then typically you'll see on the newer wells, they have a blue cap on them. The older wells could be different colors, but on the new ones, they typically have a blue cap. So that's the main difference that you're going to find between a dug well and a drilled well, is that you can't do a water quantity test on a dug well. Reason being is that a dug well is more shallow and relying more on surface water, whereas your drilled well is deeper and you're relying more on underground aquifers with the drilled well. So that's probably the main thing to be aware of when you're dealing with wells is, first of all, what kind of well is it? And then second of all, once you've determined that, if it is a drilled well, you really should be doing a water quantity test.
And that leads to one thing you have to watch for. If it's a very old house, that wellhead could be down on the ground 4 or 5 feet. So who's going to dig that up so the test can be done?
Yes, the buried well. It's like dun dun dun.
And where is it?
Because you laugh, but it's like trying to find a buried well can be a huge challenge sometimes. And so there are a limited number of people who have the ability and equipment to find those buried wellheads. Often the well drillers have the ability to do that. So they're usually the best people to contact if you're trying to locate a buried well. And there is a well log database that you can go to online. The province keeps a record, so it's the well log database. But not all wells are registered. And this system was only brought in the last, oh my gosh, the years melt together, so don't ask me to quote it exactly.
I think it was 2008.
Yeah, yeah. Sounds about right, Alex.
Don't quote me.
Yeah.
That sounds right then.
So that's always a good resource as well, to check the well log database to see. It'll tell you when the well was drilled, what the gallons per minute it was producing when it was drilled. This is the same information that you're going to find on your original well driller's report when the well was drilled. So that's one of the things that in your well and septic schedule at the top, that clause that says that the seller is going to provide any reports on the well or septic, that's one of the reports that you'd like to have if it's available. So if the house is older, if it's changed hands multiple times, it's not uncommon that you're not going to get your hands on that. And if it's an older house, it's not uncommon that you're not going to find it in the well log database. So in those situations, it's all the more important to make sure you do that well quantity test, because you really want to know what the well is producing gallons per minute. So unless the well was just drilled, like if you're dealing with a new construction, like we were just chatting about new construction, and they just drilled the well and the well driller provides you with the report when the well is drilled, then you don't need to do another flow test. They just did it. The well's brand new, it's producing what it's producing, right? Things haven't changed drastically. But as time goes on, your water tables are going to change. As there's more development in an area, the strain on that water table and under that all changes over time. So a well that was drilled 30 years ago, you know, at 100 feet or 150 feet today might not produce enough water because, you know, there's been a whole development that's gone in behind. So you've got all of those streets plus all of the other new streets that have gone in, and now everybody's drawing from that same aquifer, right? So that's why it's really important to do a well quantity test. So when we're talking about quantity, that means that you're going to have a company come in. Typically they're a specialty in water specifically. So they drill wells or they provide treatment systems on wells, and that's all they do. They don't do anything else. So they're the expert in that area, and they will come in and they will, they all kind of do it a little different, but the general way they do it is they'll come in, they'll take the well cap off, they'll unscrew the cap, they'll measure the static level of the well. And you guys stop me if I'm saying, and Alex, you jump in if I'm missing something.
Just take a breath.
But just like jump in, like raise a hand and be like, I don't know what you mean. And like, I'm just like, and we'll stop and explain it. So, but the static level of the well is basically like your reserve level in the well. So you could consider it like the storage amount of water that's being in the well. So that's the static level. And then what they do is after they measure the static level, they run the water for anywhere from a half an hour to an hour at a controlled rate. So they're measuring the gallons per minute. They often have like a flow resistor on the hose so that they have, you know, an established rate that the well is being drawn, the water's being drawn out of the well. And then after they draw it, they take measurements as the drawdown happens. And then as the well recovers, they stop running the water, and then they wait usually about another half an hour, and they measure the recovery rate of the well for the water to come back. And then from that, they're able to provide you with a pretty accurate gallons per minute that the well is producing. And then there are, you know, established guidelines, and you'll see it comes in a chart form. It's like a bar chart, and it'll give you the guidelines for each depth of well. So as the well is more shallow, you want more reserve and more gallons per minute. And then obviously as the depth of the well goes up, so if it's a deeper well, then the gallons per minute can go down because you can have more storage in the well. So obviously, when you're doing your quantity tests, you know, the absolute worst thing is when you run the well dry while you're doing the test.
just a sidebar on that too. You really shouldn't or can't do septic testing while the water testing is being done, because no water can be run during that time, and the septic dude's going to want to run water into the system. So just keep that in mind. Somebody will get annoyed if you have them both arrive at the same time. So
yeah,
don't do that.
Yeah, because the septic guy running water can impact the result of the well flow test, right?
And if you do have a well that's not producing, some of the options are, if the well is over 200 feet deep, anything less than that, this system doesn't usually work. If it's over 200 feet deep, they can do a hydrofract on the well. That's pumping water into the well at really high pressure to open up the old seams and that sort of thing. And it's probably had over a 90% success doing that, which lasts for a long, long time. If it's under 200 feet and it's a low
yield well.
Low yield, your options are to drill it deeper or to put a new well in, which is more expensive, of course.
Yeah, I had a hydrofrac done on a listing. The buyer's inspector actually ran us dry, and our aquifer closed. It didn't recover at all. We had zero water in a 300-foot well.
Wow.
So we were recovering like a gallon an hour is what Brewster's figured we were recovering by. So we did a hydrofrac, and it was about $3,000, I think. And yeah, by the time it was done, we were over, I mean, it would settle, but we were over 4 gallons a minute recovery.
Fantastic.
Wow. That's great.
That's
it's
really
crazy. You could feel the ground shaking. Like as they're like, I was standing there while they're doing it, like you could feel the ground moving under your feet.
Yeah. So just to add on to what Alex said, if you're local to HRM area, Brewster's well drilling and Blue Nose well drilling are the two main go-tos if you're in anywhere within sort of the HRM area. I can't speak to the other areas because we don't work in those areas. I know Brewster's is in Mount Uniacke, so I know that they will travel closer to the valley direction and Blue Nose is more down like the Porter's Lake side. So they kind of both cover that whole area and then out a little further. But as far as further than that, you'd have to check with some of the agents that practice in that area to know who the well drillers are, or Brewster's or Blue Nose would be able to point you in the direction of someone who services that area if they don't. But they both will do hydrofracking and they will both drill deeper. And then they will provide you with the report after. And they're both very knowledgeable and able to do that work quite efficiently. So just circling back to if you do run the well dry, doing the quantity test, the important thing to note with some of those pumps, they won't just automatically kick on. So sometimes the pump will need to be primed to come back on. So if you're the listing agent, say, and your seller comes home and they're like, there's no water in my house, da, 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 right? Sometimes it's been a few hours and there is water in the well, but the pump needs to be primed to kick back in. So just something to keep in mind. And the other thing is with the buried well heads. So obviously you can't do a really accurate flow test when you're dealing with a buried wellhead, because you can't actually, if you don't have a well driller's report, you don't know the depth of the well and you can't measure the static level of the water within that well. So often when you're dealing with a buried wellhead, you're going to want to bring that wellhead to the surface. So I guess the important thing to note with that is depending on what side of the transaction you're on, what is typical. So normally with a buried wellhead, you'd be asking the seller to make the wellhead accessible in a normal circumstance. So the seller would be responsible for hiring someone to come in, find the wellhead, and then bring it to the surface. So again, like Brewster's and Blue Nose can do that for you as well. So once they find the wellhead, then they often they can either add to the casing or replace the casing and bring it up to the surface. And the reason you want to do that is because if you ever have a problem down the road, you can't access your pump that's in the well, right? Because there's a submersible pump down there in the well. So if that goes, and you're in the middle of the winter, the ground's frozen, how are you going to get to that pump? It's going to be a big mess, right? If you start dealing with frozen ground. And we've encountered buried wells. They could be half a foot. I had one that was buried in the driveway that they had to bring in an excavator and a dump truck to dig it out. It was about 8 feet down. So there's really no rhyme or reason as to how deep the well could be buried. And that's one of the things that it's hard to estimate the cost for that for someone, because like in that particular case, even Brewster's didn't anticipate that well was going to be that deep. So they had to bring in all this extra equipment, right? They had to bring dump trucks and excavators and the whole bit to just expose the top of this well. So that's something just to consider. So if you're on the listing side, it usually comes down to the seller's responsibility to make that wellhead accessible normally. Now, from the broker standpoint, if I put my broker hat on, if you are representing the buyer and you want that wellhead exposed, you're gonna have, and you want to make sure it's done so that you can do inspections. Once you've found out that the wellhead is buried, you're gonna want to write that into your agreement of purchase and sale, or via an amendment once, you know, it's realized that it's buried, so that you can ensure the work's done in order for you to do your test. And then obviously you'll have to adjust all your timelines accordingly so that you can then ensure that your buyer can get, you know, the appropriate testing done that they want to get done. And it's just, it's one of those things that it's can be a surprise sometimes. And often a seller, you know, will mention it offhand. Oh yeah, the well's, you know, in the front yard, in the flower garden. And, you know, that's a good question to ask them. Is it accessible? Right? And they'll say, oh, no, it's buried, you know, 2 feet down. Oh, really? Have you had any issues with that? Have you looked into raising it and bringing it to the surface? Because that's likely something that a buyer is going to ask for as part of their inspections, right?
Maybe we should talk about the pros and cons of the dug well. Alex, you want to talk about that?
Pros and cons of dug well. Yeah. Pros and cons of dug well. Like, I grew up in a dug well. You're typically going to have cleaner water, as it's surface water, rainwater that's usually entering them. You're not getting some of those deep in the earth metals and minerals. However, you're pretty much almost guaranteed going to have potential for bacteria issues. You're going to get plant matter in them. You're going to potentially get insect and rodent matter in them. So having a UV light system in the house is definitely suggestible. The other problem is, like Melissa was saying, they're much more shallow. Even though they're 4 feet around, they're usually only 16 to 20 feet deep. So running them dry is a lot more frequent. So just if you have a buyer looking to buy a dug well, just let them know that like your water is not guaranteed endless. More so like with a dug well, 300-foot dug well, that's a lot of gallons that you have to play with. And running them dry is pretty rare. Yeah, but like Melissa said, you can't really test them for much other than quality. You can ask the questions if they've ever gone dry. You can usually take the lid off, take a look in your memory bank. How long has it been since it rained? Where's the water sitting at? Is it a foot below the ground? Is it 4 crocks deep? And then you can kind of start to gauge like what the well kind of sits and performs like. Also look at where it sits in the lay of the land. Like, is it on top of a hill or is it down in a gully? Because I mean, water is going to run downhill. So typically you want your dug well to be downhill of any land around that it can be from.
Alex, is it okay to ask the seller, I guess you can ask them anything you want, but could you ask the seller how many loads of water they buy in the run of a year?
Yeah, definitely. I would be asking that for sure. Most places are going to tell you none, but
yes.
But definitely keep in mind and just let your buyers know like it's potential to happen, especially in the summer. Yeah. Mid-August, July, September, you may end up having to call and get a $60 load of water delivered.
So if it's not that expensive, we're paying for municipal water as well. So that could kind of offset the cost of delivering a couple of loads of water, I suppose.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's what we paid for water growing up. Very rare. We usually get a load a year. I'm sure it's more expensive now. Another thing I was going to bring up is the third water system that I run into a lot because I deal a lot in West Hants and out here in Prospect near the ocean is the good old cistern, which people are terrified of.
They are.
Yes, they
are.
Yeah.
And they shouldn't be.
No. It's just a dug well that can't get its water from the ground. It's all going to be top fed, whether it's from rain or from fill. So you'll often see, you'll see a cistern. They'll either be inside or outside. A lot of old houses, they're inside, big concrete box in the middle of the basement. When you peek over it, you just find water with usually a bunch of chicken wire over the top of it and a bunch of leaves. But that's exactly what it is. It's just like a dug well, but it has to get its water from from rain or from like mostly rain or delivery. Usually you'll notice if it's got a cistern, the gutters will be all tied together and running into the basement. If it's an outdoor one, you'll usually find what looks like a well crock, like what looks like a wellhead, but it's usually smaller, 2 feet diameter or so. You'll see it poking out beside the driveway somewhere or in the front lawn. And it's just a big concrete box under the ground holding your water. The biggest thing to know with them is same as dug well, you're going to have bacteria issues potentially, or at least a better chance of having them. And if you're on the buyer side, I know I have before, I asked for it to be professionally cleaned. So what the seller does is pumps it out completely. A company goes in and basically scrub brushes it with Javex, washes it out, and then fills it back up for closing with providing a potable water sample. Yeah. Any questions? Anything?
No questions yet?
Nobody's had water issues?
Some people talk about the quality of water too, right?
Yeah.
Some things in water are cosmetic, or some things are dangerous if not taken care of. So you should talk to your buyers about what their concerns are about the water and explain to them that arsenic, uranium, bacteria, and maybe some heavy-duty metals are dangerous, whereas some other things are just smelly or hard.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that's one of the things you want to make sure you have that conversation with your buyers. If you're representing the buyers, is what their comfort level is as far as water. If they've never been on a well before and they're coming from municipal, then they'll likely be a little bit more concerned going into something that they're not familiar with. So you may want to advise them in that particular case to do a little bit more testing, because there's a whole gamut of tests that you can do. And so, if you're using one of the water treatment companies to do your flow test, many of them will do your flow test and they'll actually take your water quantity sample, and which is great because they'll take the sample and they'll take it to the lab for you. So you've got 2 options with the sampling. You can do the public lab, which takes longer. So you can get the water test bottles and then have the sample taken. Now, just from the broker side, you as the agent are not allowed to take a water sample ever, period. Okay? Because then you open up yourself to liability. Okay, so it cannot be you that takes a sample. If your buyer doesn't want to pay to have the water, a water treatment company, some of the home inspectors will even take a sample. Now the home inspectors typically use the public lab. So you're going to need to make sure that your condition dates are longer, because the public lab will not turn around results as quick as the private lab. The public lab, generally speaking, you're going to need minimum 7 business days. So not even counting your weekend in there. And most cases, it's almost 2 full weeks. So you're looking at like 10 business days for the public lab, where the private lab will usually turn around a result in about a week. The private lab also has the option to put a rush on it. Now you're going to pay for the luxury of rushing your result. But in this market where you're competing, you want to get conditions met as quickly as possible. Often buyers are also on a time crunch. We've got quick closings trying to happen and all of that. So in that case, it can be very advantageous for your buyer to agree to pay for that extra rush because you're going to get those results turned around that much faster. And, even with the rush, you can still do the full gamut of testing. So you can do the bacteria, you can do all, arsenic, uranium, all the metals, and still get that back. But it's, like I said, it's going to come at a premium for them to do that. So just make sure that you're having that conversation with the buyer to make sure they understand and they're aware of what they want. And when you're looking at doing your conditions, you want to make sure that you've given yourself enough time to get somebody in there to take the sample, get the sample to the lab, and then you need that turnaround time for the sample to come back. So with the public lab, with their forms from Department of Environment, they have like different levels. So you'll see like budget homeowner is like the really basic one. And then I can't remember what the middle one is called. And then you get the one that's a little more all encompassing, that has more of the metals, like the iron, the manganese, all of that stuff. That's usually, I think the third option is more expensive. And that's sort of how the public lab does it. The private lab test results, they're similar. They do packages, but you can, if you have a client that's really concerned about one particular thing, yes, lead, Dad just said lead, and that's where I was gonna go. Lead it seems to be at the forefront of people's minds lately. So often it's included in that package, but if it's not, if there was a specific thing your buyer wanted to test for, they have the ability to like check off, whatever X thing is that they're really concerned about. So you want to make sure that they're actually taking the time to review that part of your inspection process, so that you know that they're getting exactly what they want for results and that they're comfortable. One of the other things to consider with water quantity or quality testing is that you have various types of treatment systems that can already be on the water. So if the water's hard and there's a lot of iron, you're often going to find a water softener. So you'll see that it's usually a big black plastic bin that you have to put salt in. And then next to it is a tall cylinder, which is your membrane filter. And that system backwashes the water, usually set to happen at night when everybody's in bed and not using the water. So that helps soften the water. And that's a whole house treatment system. And that can also help with some of the staining and discoloration that happens with iron. So, there's all kinds of different systems. Alex mentioned earlier the UV light, which is, like he said, very, very common in a shallow well, like a dug well or a cistern. And even in drilled wells, you'll find bacteria. So a UV light will treat for any bacteria. So it's usually a good thing when you see the UV light there. That means they've already got it in place and they're treating it. You just want to make sure that the bulb has been replaced. So if the bulb's not shiny, usually you'll see like that little blue glow when you're down there, or they'll have a light like that. It's green means it's working, and red or yellow means it's like needs to be replaced, or red means it's burnt out. You want to make sure that that's been changed or is working. If it's not working, you want to get it changed before you take your sample, because that's going to affect your bacteria result. The other, common thing you'll see is what's called a reverse osmosis, and that's typically used to treat arsenic. So when you're showing a house, you'll see like a little tiny, we'll call it like a spigot on the kitchen sink, and it'll come up sort of next to your kitchen tap. And that little spigot, if you open underneath the sink, open the cabinets, and you'll look and you'll see like a small pressure tank. It's usually white, and then usually 3 cylinders of filters. And it's all kind of contained right there under the kitchen sink. That's a reverse osmosis system, and that's to treat arsenic. So typically the reason you see them on the kitchen sink is because of drinking water, and the person wants to make sure that the drinking water, has that extra level of treatment. If your arsenic level is really, really high, you may want to chat with your buyer and the water treatment company about a whole house arsenic treatment system. They do offer those as well. They're a lot more expensive than just an under sink reverse osmosis. And they do tend to use quite a bit more water. So there, varying factors on which makes the most sense, but typically you'll see a whole house arsenic system if the arsenic level is really, really high to the point where people don't want to shower, bathe, brush their teeth in it. Where if the arsenic level is just at the sort of required level, which is 10 right now, it keeps going down and down and down. Years ago it was 20. Anyway, it's 10 now and has been for, I don't know, 10 years now, I would say, or more. So, you know, if your level was close to that 10 mark, you might decide just on the kitchen sink is fine because it's not over and you're fine with the rest of it. But for your drinking and your baking and all of that, like things you're really going to consume a lot of water, you're going to use that kitchen tap system. So that's why you'll see two. So if you see a reverse osmosis, it's often a good idea to inquire a little bit, like, do they require, is this a necessary thing for their water treatment? Or, you know, is the person just really fussy about their water? Because sometimes you'll see people put treatment on when they don't need it. There were some builders that were putting reverse osmosis systems in their new homes that were on wells when they didn't require them, just as an added extra for the homeowner. Now that was 2 years ago before COVID, so it's probably changed. But yeah, so just be aware that that's what it is, and you know, it's something to ask a question about. And if your buyer's wondering why it's there, that's typically why it's there.
I've also seen them on homes where there's been a health issue.
Yes.
And people have reverse osmosis in their kitchen just because, for health reasons, and whatever that might be. There's so many different situations where they would choose to have that. So that sometimes you wonder, are they really telling, you know, are they being on the up and up with some of that? But, you know, that is definitely one where I've seen it where it hasn't been needed, it hasn't been required, but they've just opted to do it.
And if you're really curious about what's in the water, you take one before the machine and one after the machine.
Right. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So it might cost your buyer a little bit more, but if they want to know what they're dealing with as far as a raw water sample, then absolutely. It might be to their benefit to take one before the treatment and after the treatment, so they see exactly what they're dealing with, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we've done them a few times, and then before the machine was fine.
Yes. Yeah. And they just had the treatment because they wanted, you know, it often was an aesthetic thing or a peace of mind thing for the person living there, right?
Yeah. You can, and I mean, once you learn all these systems, you can start pegging these in showings. You don't need to wait for the inspections. I'm always, every time I show a house, I'm pointing out systems that are there. I'm basically saying, like, either there are issues or it's good. Like, these systems are already there, they're existing, they're newer looking, they look like they're upkept. Like, can't say for sure, but water quality looks like it should be in the green.
It's often one of the things that I find when we're dealing with sellers and you ask them, you know, on the PDS, when was your last water test? And they're like, and you're like, oh, you haven't tested it in the last 10 years? Probably should test it, right? So that's another thing, like, that you can preemptively avoid some issues when you get to the offer stage. If you're on the listing side, you know, suggest to them, why don't you, you know, go pick up some water test bottles from Department of Environment. We do have some in the office as well. So if you wanted to, you know, give them the 2 bottles from the public lab, and they can, the seller can take their own sample if it's for their own use, right? Drop them off to the lab, which is downtown at the VG on University. And then they know what their result is. So if there is an issue, they could, you know, take care of it before you get to that offer stage and you're dealing with a buyer who's, you know, then you're on a time crunch trying to get a water treatment company to come in and quote a system and install a system and all that stuff. It can save you a little bit of headache. But, you know, any of the water treatment companies, many of them, they're very knowledgeable and are able to give you pretty quick service. You just need to make sure that you're contacting them with enough time that they can actually get the work done, right? And if you're dealing with an issue in the offer process, and you do need to, you know, put a treatment system on because you've been asked by, you know, the buyer agent to put, you know, a UV light on or a reverse osmosis or whatever the case may be. They often will also stipulate in the amendment that the water is going to be retested after the system's installed. And so if you're on the buyer side, that's also a recommendation. If you're the one drafting the amendment, you want to make sure that you're asking for that sample to be taken after the system's installed, because your buyer needs a clean water test for the bank. So you need to be able to show the bank that there's clean potable water. So it could affect their financing by not having that clean sample. And also you want to verification that, you know, the work that's been completed for the treatment system is doing its job and it's treating what it's supposed to treat. So the key thing in that is that you want to make sure in that particular case that you stipulate that a professional water treatment company completes the work and also completes the test. You don't want to test a water test result in that particular situation from the seller, because as much as we want to have, you know, good faith in other people, there's no guarantee that a seller is not going to take a sample from their neighbor's house next door that's got the fanciest water treatment system on the street and pass that off as their sample, right? You want to give people the benefit of the doubt, but you also need to make sure you're protecting your buyer. So it's always best to stipulate that the work for the treatment system and the sample is taken by a professional water treatment company and results provided to the buyer and their agents on a before X date, which is going to be before your closing date, so that you've got it in hand before your closing.
Mm-hmm. And if you do run into a problem with either a dug or a drilled well, you can always get quotations from the reputable well drillers as to how much a new well would cost or how much it would cost to deepen it 100 feet, which involves new pumps and hoses and stuff as well. So those aren't too hard to get. No.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Any questions? Any like odd situations that you've encountered or you've heard about that you're wondering about? Anything we haven't covered that you guys are curious about?
I have sort of a question more on a personal note, I guess, if that's okay. My grandparents live in an area where there has been known to be arsenic in the water. So actually the neighbors on either side, like both of their houses directly beside them, just sold within the last year, and they're the last ones there. But both of the homes had really high levels of arsenic in the water. And I'm just thinking to myself, you know, it's likely that your house probably does too if it's in the area. But is that test that you were talking about, like the spigot that's usually on the taps, is that something that's standard like in every home, or would they not have that and they should maybe look into getting that? Or
it wouldn't be standard. That the first place to start would be to test the water to see what you're dealing with, and then
right.
if arsenic's there, then depending on what the level is would determine what treatment system makes the most sense. But typically, you know, when you see that reverse osmosis system with the spigot on the kitchen sink, it's because of arsenic. And you will typically find arsenic happens in pockets. So if the neighbors have it, you're correct to make the assumption that your grandparents' house has it as well, because the arsenic kind of runs in veins, and you'll find it sort of deposited in the same area. It's similar to like radon. There's been some research that there's correlation between the appearance of radon and arsenic because of the granite. So often you'll find like there's a specific area that's known to have higher levels of arsenic, and it's because of the ground in that area.
Yeah.
Right. Awesome. Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions? You guys are being shy.
No. Crickets.
A little bit of a tip then maybe. If you have sold a house to somebody that's on a drilled well and they call you up and they say, we have no water, what's going on? You might say to them, well, has the power gone off recently? And if they say it has, then tell them just to go down to their pressure tank. And there's a little newer ones don't have this, but typically you'll find a little key, L-shaped key at the bottom of the pressure tank. And all they have to do is lift it about halfway and you'll hear the water start to come, let it go, and their problem is over. We tell buyers that all the time, and then we get a call about a year later saying, we've got no water, and we had to tell them again.
Yeah.
It saves them a couple $100 to call a plumber and find out something very simple.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it often it's like clockwork. We have a power outage, and then they'll run a tap or they'll flush a toilet, not thinking about it, and then that makes the pump need to be primed again.
Yeah, I think I'd show that to every buyer.
Yeah.
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 So some other tips. Your salt that makes the water soft and a hard water, they shouldn't fill those containers up to the top.
Yeah.
About half or less is enough salt to put in the container.
Yeah.
So
it's usually like a high-low mark, same as like your coolant jug underneath the hood of your car. They try to keep the salt in those lines.
See, some people fill them right up to the top, so I don't have to do it so often, but that's not what you should do.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know. I ran into this with a listing this year. Just to reiterate what you said earlier, Melissa, like have your sellers, if they have water systems, have your sellers like get them gone over. Especially in my case, my lady disconnected her softener because she didn't like how it made her hair feel.
Yeah.
And then we go to list the house, and the softener has been sitting stagnant for years. So of course it was an issue. And then of course it never came back to real life. And it ended up costing her $6,000 in the end to get a whole new system put in, because the whole house, the water was amazingly bad. And she took it on the chin. She knew that she did it. She unhooked her water systems that she didn't like. And yeah, $6,000 less on closing day.
Wow.
Oh, that's
yeah.
I have a question about, and I don't know what's on the form, but I know the KW acknowledgement and waiver that we have our clients sign off on. Inside my head, I remember, I believe that the first two were option for water sample. There's two options on that. Can you maybe explain to me the difference between the two options that typically are offered to clients and what typically they use most often for testing? Or do we kind of leave that up to, obviously the water people know best, but I believe there's two options there. Am I right?
There's testing. There's the one for the testing, and then there's the flow test. I think there's one specific to dug well and one specific to drilled well. I don't recall two for the testing though.
I think it's quality and quantity, not two.
That's all it was. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, then. Thanks. Yeah.
And they should do both.
Yes.
Absolutely. Okay. And another thing, it's nice to have the reminder about getting your water tested. Very important. So maybe that's something we should be promoting on a regular basis with our clients, depending where we live. I'm just thinking when I door knock, I might just grab a couple extra bottles. So if you see me walking down the street, this might have some test waters, bottles, things in there. So I'll just go lug it along, and then maybe someday I'll have a hockey bag. So
make sure you put your little card under the elastic band around the bottles. Okay?
Yeah.
Smart. Adding value. That's important. Yeah. I mean, I've lived here for how many years, and we need to test ours. So just a little bit of an aha moment for myself. So everybody's
like that though. Yeah. Like it's so shocking. Like when you talk to people and you're like, when did you last fish your water? It's like years.
And then you tell them that there's a bacteria. Yes. We've been drinking it for years.
That's like the last one we did. they you know, they had a treatment system. They said the water's fine, no problem, what, you know, whatever, won't have any issue. And of course, then the water test came back and they had bacteria. So the buyers wanted a UV light, and you know, as soon as the result came back, I said, "You guys, you've got bacteria." I said, "Are you drinking your water?" And they said, "Oh yeah, we've been drinking it for years." And I went, "Okay." Like,
especially when we're so conscientious about what we consume in our bodies. You know, it's the water is where we start. So it's just a good reminder.
Yeah.
So, Jen, you are correct on the KW acknowledgement. There are 2 lines. One is for water quality analysis for E. coli and coliform, and the second one is for metals and aesthetic elements.
Okay.
Oh, yes. Thank you, Dennis.
Way to lawyer us.
So the bank only requires the arsenic, bacteria, and uranium. So
yeah.
The first one is what you need for your mortgage.
Yeah. Another thing you can do if you're buzzing around showing houses and you want to know, like I know, for instance, out where I'm from in West Hants, iron is prevalent. So hard water. You can look at the sink, look inside the tea. Well, I mean, it's COVID, but like you can sometimes even see inside like the tea kettle. Like, is it scaly and white? You can pretty much tell if you're gonna have hard water right there. Inside the dishwasher, if it's got that milky white film. And
the back of the toilet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just about to say.
That's Dad's trick.
Open
you
the
lift
toilet.
the cover off the toilet and look in, and you're like, oh.
Yeah. If the back tank is just red brown, you have iron, guaranteed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we have the same thing out our way, Alex. It's very common for high iron in the Fall River, like Waverly, Wellington, Oakfield, like all this whole area. And it's the same thing. Water softeners. If there's not a water softener, you're surprised.
Yeah. And the other thing you run into, many of the inspectors will tell you now, there's 2 different stories or more than that with this, but if you do have a water softener, most of them don't want the effluent from the water softener going into your septic tank. They want it going off into a dry well or somewhere probably that's illegal.
Yes.
Yeah. Not into your septic system.
Yes. So that's an important thing to know, is that, yes, the septic inspector will point that out. If the backwash for the water softener goes into the septic, it can diminish the life of the septic because you've got that salt going in that can affect the bacteria levels in your septic. So that you don't want to see it backwashed.
And you'll see it taking the cover off septic. It's just like it's hanging in salt.
Mm-hmm. Yes. All in the tank.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's the glamorous part of our job, right? Standing over septic tanks.
It's usually not that big a fix, really.
No.
Usually you can drill a hole through the concrete wall or the box header and get the effluent line out into a dry well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. One thing we didn't mention with the dug wells, if you're in an area like Alex mentioned, really close to the ocean, often your only option is a dug well there, because if you drill, you start to get salt water.
Also near the gypsum mines up near Elmsdale Land.
So you get the gypsum. So like Prospect, like that way. Porter's Lake is another spot where you'll find a lot of drilled wells as you get down closer to like Lawrencetown end. Dug wells, sorry, is what I meant. Because you start to hit the salt water, and then like Dad said, out Enfield Way by the gypsum mines. So sometimes the dug well is there out of a necessity because they can't put a drilled well because they can't go any deeper.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no. My parents built in '98. We live in just outside of Windsor, between 2 gypsum quarries. We have a 5 crock dug well, and even our surface water at 25 feet was so hard that it literally destroyed the dishwasher in 2 weeks.
Wow.
From moving in.
2 weeks. Wow.
Just from so we have had a water softener my whole life. Yeah. Definitely something to keep an eye on out in those areas. If you see a drilled well out in Elmsdale, Enfield, or West Hants, I'd want to be looking into it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it does, like, you know, there are pockets, like you said, Melissa, that there's pockets of different issues, and it can change from one yard to the next. Like it's so crazy how it can happen. You know, we're very thankful we have great water. We don't have any issues, but one of our neighbors has like $10,000 worth of water treatment equipment.
And it's really important because that hardness can actually plug up your water lines, your heating lines. It can actually close off a piece of pipe.
Yeah, exactly. I know. And we were shocked when we keep checking our water just to make sure. It's like, is it changed? Because there's so much development in Fall River, right? There's so much construction, and it can change from year to year.
Yeah. No more questions?
Well, this is neat. I think we'll see you in a week or so on septic, so that'll be fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, the transition will be water treatment into your septic or not into your septic.
Yeah. It's 2 weeks time, isn't it, Janice?
Yeah.
2 weeks.
2 weeks.
2 weeks.
Yeah,
not next Tuesday, but the next Tuesday.
Right.
If you're talking to any of our other people, make sure you tell them how much fun we have on these things.
Yeah.
Yes.
I know, it's always one of these ones that you can learn from, because it's something that we all have to deal with and we all come face to face with.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah. I think it's just, you definitely, like, you got to know these things. I mean, it's scary how many out there don't. And like, can be leading people into a $400,000 thing. They don't understand what they own, what needs to be maintained, taken care of.
Yep.
Yeah, and there have been, you know, not to scare people, but if, you know, there have been court cases where, you know, a buyer didn't do a flow test on a well and then moved in and didn't have enough water, right? And there's, you know, they've sued the previous seller, and it's been, you know, so there is some not legislation. There's been some precedent on, you know, court cases for that within Canada. So that's why, you know, it's so important that you as their agent are advising them on that. And if they choose to waive, if your buyer chooses to waive the flow test, you really want to get them to sign that waiver that we've got for you, because that helps to protect you. So that you got, you know, something in writing, a record that you did advise them to do it and they chose not to. So, you know, if they move in and there's no water and they come back and try to point the finger at you, you could say, no, we did have the conversation and I advised you, and here's the waiver I even got you to sign because you chose not to do it. Right.
I know there's been a situation where a couple of our agents, or one agent at least from another country that works for us, didn't have any idea what a well and a septic was all about. They thought the water came out of the tap and the sewer went away. So they didn't even put a well and a septic schedule in. So anyway, that's bad news, of course. But.
Yeah.
Yeah, costing a lot of money.
Yes, it does. So, but you guys are all here, so you're gonna know what to do. Yeah. So it's fantastic.
Maybe I'll have to do my continuing education on septics and staying in my lane before 2 weeks' time.
There you go. Yeah.
All right.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Alex and Melissa and Jerry, for taking the time. It's it's really good to be able to share information and make sure everybody's got the right facts and not assumptions that are being made when it comes to something like this that's so important and can really, on either the buyer or the seller side, run us into some pretty big issues and some pretty big problems. So the more we understand about it, the more we're able to pass on, and the more value you're providing to your clients. So it's awesome.
Yeah. Great, thank you.
Thanks for coming, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Bye.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Everybody have a good day.
See you. Bye.